Politicians do not take time out to organize the community as a matter of
No to Marcos' return. No to Duterte return. Bongbong Marcos Jr. and Sara Duterte have brought their fascist dynasties together in order to steal power in the upcoming national elections in May. With the Marcos and Duterte return to Malacanang, we can only anticipate brutal dictatorship, martial law, and intensifying neoliberal economic policies, such as a labor export policy, LEP, that is responsible for the forced migration of kababayan and making the Filipino nation one of the largest diasporas in the world.
Ever since Marcos established the LEP, our families have been forced abroad to countries such as the United States with hopes of achieving the American dream, only to be met with economic hardship and family separation, all while bearing the pressure and responsibility to support loved ones in the US and the Philippines. As Filipino youth in the US, we have witnessed and experienced these very same sacrifices and struggles amongst our own family members. The election of Bongbong Marcos as president would multiply this harsh reality for millions of more families, as he's promised to continue his father's neoliberal labor export scheme. On the other hand, if Sara Duterte comes into power as vice president, we can only expect a continuation of her father's selling out of national sovereignty and militarized COVID response. For youth, Duterte's COVID-19 response has led to one of the world's longest school shutdowns, impacting access to education with no social services to attend virtually. Meanwhile, funding that could be used for education has been poured into Duterte's counterinsurgency war and the National Task Force to End Local Communist Armed Conflict, or the NTF-LCAC, which has targeted Filipino youth back home and overseas and their right to organize. Sara Duterte, who announced plans to make military conscription mandatory for young people 18 years old and over, would further silence the youth and feed them into that very same war machine terrorizing its own people. She would no doubt also continue to implement the anti-terror law, which Filipino youth across the US protested against precisely because its provisions extend to even us overseas.
So just as Filipino youth saw their own stake in fighting the Marcos dictatorship during people power, we must see our role in fighting against the return of that dictatorship today. Youth represent 30% of registered voters in the Philippines, and youth between the ages of 18 to 35 also make up 30% of Filipinos in the US. We have the power to put pressure on those running for a seat in power in these upcoming elections by showing them that Filipino youth in the US and our families have something at stake. Pandemic response, forced migration, attacks on dissent, government neglect, and so many others. And most importantly, we have the power to build a mass movement to turn the tide against the Marcos and Duterte dynasties. In continuing the fight against the return of Marcos and Duterte, we remember the thousands of activists and martyrs who fought back against the Marcos regime and contributed greatly to its downfall, even if they did not live to see it. We remember the years of painstaking resistance during the first quarter storm, led by the revolutionary youth organization Kabataang Makabayan, which persisted through the 70s and made people power possible. As Filipino youth, we must remember how youth were at the forefront of this struggle, tirelessly organizing in their campuses, communities, and the urban and rural areas where the majority of Filipino were.
With the Akbayan USA's 10-year anniversary approaching this May, the same time as the Philippine elections, we call on all Filipino youth and students in the US to join and build chapters of an Akbayan. And for all Filipino youth and student organizations, link arms with us and the rest of the Filipino people, channeling our revolutionary legacy to defeat Marcos and defeat Duterte. Let us do everything in our power to make it known that we will not stand for another dictatorship. Let's be prepared to fight back and use our people power, both at the ballot and beyond, to topple these political dynasties and ultimately topple the rotten system that they represent. Never again to Marcos. Never again to Duterte. Youth, let us unite and fight to defeat fascism.
responsibility for organizing our people rests on each and every one of our shoulders, not just on one person's shoulder, not just a leader on the community, not just a preacher, but everybody has a responsibility to help organize the people. And perhaps in our discussion today, as we said, if this can come across more than anything else, then we will have served our purpose, that is,